Okay, let's start with a pretty wild thought. What if one of the most basic categories of your identity, something you think is a simple biological fact, was actually a cultural invention? Today, we're diving into a powerful idea that really challenges the way we see the world. And it all starts by questioning a word we use every single day. So our guide for this exploration is the Nigerian sociologist Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí and her game-changing book, The Invention of Women. Her whole point is that Western ways of thinking have kind of projected their own ideas about gender onto the whole world. And her entire argument kicks off with one really radical question. Just think about that for a second. What if the category woman, which feels so natural, so obviously rooted in biology, was actually an idea? Something that wasn't native to every society but was imported, kind of like a foreign product. This is the big, explosive idea we're digging into today. Now, Oyèwùmí doesn't ease you into this. Nope, she starts with a statement that is so direct, so surprising, it just flips the whole conversation about gender on its head. That's right. She argues that in the pre-colonial Yoruba society of West Africa, there was no social group you could call women. It just wasn't a concept. So if gender wasn't the main way they organized their world, what was? Well, to even begin to wrap our heads around their system, we first have to see the hidden assumptions we're living with in our own. Oyèwùmí argues that Western thought is built on this core assumption, one that's so deep it's like the air we breathe. We don't even notice it's there. She gives it a name, biologic. So what is biologic? Put simply, it's the idea that our physical bodies are the natural blueprint for our social world. It's that deep-down belief that biology is destiny. And from this viewpoint, categories like man and woman aren't just descriptions. They're basically instructions for how society is supposed to be organized. And this biologic leads to a bunch of assumptions many of us just take as truth. You know, the idea that gender categories have always existed everywhere, that it's the most important way to divide people up, and that women being subordinate is just a historical fact of life. Oyèwùmí's work comes in and says, hold on a minute. These aren't universal truths. They're the product of one very specific way of seeing the world. So if that's one way of seeing things, what's the alternative? Well, Oyèwùmí takes us inside the pre-colonial Yoruba world, a society that was built on a completely different foundation. And this comparison here just lays it all out. The difference is stark. In the West, gender tends to create a fixed social ranking. But in the pre-colonial Yoruba system, the #1 organizing principle was seniority, which was all about relative age. Your place in society wasn't locked in by your body, it was fluid, always changing depending on who you were talking to. So, here's the key. Respect, power, your social standing, it was all determined by who was older in any given situation, not by their anatomy. An older person, no matter their body type, had seniority over a younger person. Simple as that. Now, this doesn't mean people ignored biological differences. Of course not. Oyèwùmí is very clear. People saw bodies for what they were, but those differences were seen as, well, superficial. They just didn't carry the huge social weight that they do in the West. Your anatomy didn't automatically give you power or put you at the bottom of the ladder. And that brings us right back to her core argument. When Oyèwùmí says there were no women, she means there was no social bucket that lumped people together based only on their anatomy with a shared identity and social position. That whole idea just wasn't there. Okay, so if the Yoruba system was organized by seniority, what happened? How did gender become such a central idea? Well, Oyèwùmí argues it was invented, or maybe a better word is imported, and it came with colonialism. This process didn't happen overnight. It happened in stages. First came sustained contact with the British. And the colonial administrators and missionaries, they brought their biologic with them. They looked at Yoruba society, couldn't imagine a world not organized by gender, so they just imposed their own system. For instance, they set up schools that separated boys and girls. They introduced laws that assigned things like property rights based on a male-dominated model. Bit by bit, they created new gendered hierarchies that simply hadn't existed before. And the impact of this was deep and long-lasting. This Western, gendered way of seeing the world became so dominant, it was taught in the new universities, it became the new common sense. Over time, even African scholars who were trained in these Western ways of thinking started looking at their own history through that same gendered lens, which only reinforced the very categories that had been imported in the first place. So why does all this matter? I mean, it's more than just a fascinating piece of history. It's about how the very tools we use to understand the world can actually end up shaping it. This quote from Oyèwùmí just nails the idea perfectly. When Western scholars looked at Yoruba society, they saw gender because, well, that's the lens they were looking through. It was already in their eye, part of their cultural and academic toolkit. Oyèwùmí's point is that in the process of trying to see gender, they were actually helping to create it in that new context. All right, let's pull all these threads together. What's the big picture here? First, the category of woman, as we know it, isn't a universal given. It's a product of a very specific Western biologic. Second, we've seen there are alternatives, like the precolonial Yoruba society, which was organized by seniority and age. Third, we've traced how colonialism didn't just conquer land, it imposed a new social reality. And maybe most importantly, we've learned that the lens we use to look at the world can literally change the world we see. And that leaves us with one last massive question to chew on. If something we see as fundamental as woman can be shown to be a cultural and historical invention, what other categories, what other obvious truths about our social world are we just accepting without a second thought? It's a question that doesn't just change how we see the past, but how we understand ourselves right here, right now.